ในลำดับถัดไปนะครับเดี๋ยวในขณะนี้นะครับกำลังแบบเซตเวทีนะครับก็จะถือว่านะครับเป็นช่วงเวลาสำคัญนะครับที่
ก่อนที่จะเข้าสู่การเสวนาในช่วงที่1นะคะช่วงแรกของเรานั่นเองค่ะหัวข้อที่ทุกท่านนะคะจะได้ร่วมฟังนะคะก็คือการปาฐกถานำในหัวข้อ Narratives as Conditions of Possibility and Sense Making Novels by Selected Philippines Women Writers in English โดย Professor Dr. JORDANA Luna PISON นะคะ University of the Philippine Diliman ค่ะแล้วก็ผู้สรุปประเด็นนะคะก็คือผู้ช่วยศาสตราจารย์ดร.ชุติมามณีวัฒนานะคะก่อนอื่นนะคะดิฉันก็ขอแนะนำนะคะประวัติขององค์ปาฐกของเราก่อนนะคะ Professor Dr. JORDANA Luna PISON นะคะปัจจุบันนะคะ she teaches Philippine Literature and Critical Theory at the Department of English and Comparative Literature of the College of Arts and Letters in University of the Philippines Diliman. She works on Philippines novels, alternative history, martial law novels, and cultural memory in 2005, and lectures License Sexing the Nation in Novels by Philippines Women Writers 1993 to 2006. In 2010, were published by the UP Press, and her essays on dance and literature are included in various journals, anthology, and collections.
ครับและสำหรับนะครับประวัติของผู้ช่วยศาสตราจารย์ดร.ชุติมามณีวัฒนานะครับซึ่งจะเป็นผู้สรุปประเด็นนะครับก็ปัจจุบันท่านดำรงตำแหน่งผู้ช่วยศาสตราจารย์ประจำสาขาวิชาศิลปะการละครนะครับคณะศิลปกรรมศาสตร์มหาวิทยาลัยราชภัฏสวนสุนันทาขอเรียนเชิญองค์ปาฐกด้านบนเวทีครับขอเรียนเชิญครับ
ขอเสียงปรบมือให้กับองค์ปาฐกของเราด้วยนะคะขอบคุณค่ะ
Good morning, everyone, distinguished guests, the Vice President for Research and Development, representatives of the National Research Council of Thailand and Thai Humanities Forum, and the students and faculty of the Suwan Sunanda Rajabat University. Good morning to everyone, and thank you for inviting me. Such a pleasure. The pleasure is mine. So my talk this morning is entitled Narratives as Conditions of Possibility and Sense Making, Novels by Selected Philippine Women Writers in English. Time and again, critics of Philippine literature in English have commented on the nexus between the novel and issues of nationhood. The obscuracy of this relationship may be found in discussions of Philippine fiction by several literary historians and critics. The recent developments in fiction, such as those in speculative fiction, crime fiction, chick literature, and novels that fall under the category of genre fiction, show a shift in concern among young writers. Observations about the Philippine novel in English and the vagaries of Philippine nationhood still hold true. The Philippine Centennial Literary Prize Competition, it's a one-of-a-kind literary competition in our country, sponsored by our very own president years ago to celebrate the centennial of Philippine independence from Spain, is an indisputable example of how even the state recognizes the value of literature in contributing to people's ideological consciousness of the nation. Any appraisal of this substantial interest in Philippine fiction in political issues of nationhood must likewise tease out how the discourse of gender is woven into the fabric of the discourse of the nation. This is an imperative, not just because gender is by default connected with imagining the nation, but also because there have been a number of Philippine novels authored by Filipino women writers. If the novel is the genre through which society and women writers conceive and construct their society and ultimately their nation, any analysis of the novel must go beyond the mere identification of female characters and their roles vis-a-vis the nation in literary texts. More important than simply stating how Philippine novels in English by women are deeply implicated in the discourse of the nation is determining whether or not their ideological underpinnings contain the contradictions of the Philippine nation. But before proceeding, let me give a short background on Philippine fiction in English. Its provenance is a long tradition of various kinds of narratives in different Philippine languages. So the Philippines, we have 7,100 islands, and we have many, many languages, not just dialects. So we have different narratives from different regions. The Philippine novel, on the other hand, was modeled after that of the West because we were occupied by the Americans. Has its roots in local epics, ballads, and other short narratives. The Spanish occupation, we were also conquered by the Spaniards for 300 years. Okay, this occupation resulted in the introduction of additional types of narratives, such as magical romances and narratives about the lives of saints. The Philippines' first realistic fiction or novels, the Noli Me Tangere, and the El Filibusterismo. These were written in Spanish by our national hero Jose Rizal, who was familiar with his nation's literature as well as those of Europe. He was also educated in Europe. The history of Philippine literature in English dates back to the time when the American colonized the Philippines and established a public school system ran by soldiers and professional teachers. English as a medium of instruction was made integral to the colonial policy. Although the co-educational system shocked the conservative Filipinos, those from the lower middle and lower class embraced the arrangement because education and even school supplies were made free. Young girls crowded the classrooms, sitting side by side with the boys, and competed with the boys for the first time in Philippine history. Girls found to their astonishment that they could not only compete with the boys intellectually, but also outdistance them. So these are pictures of how our girls now started to go to school with the boys. Right? In other words, English leveled the playing field for women, some of who became accomplished writers. For example, when author of the Philippines' first modern short story, Paz Marquez Benitez, graduated from high school in her province, she had not only become proficient in English, the language of the new conqueror, but fortunately or unfortunately, it had become for her, as for thousands of young Filipino people, the language in which she could best express herself. Her Spanish was ceremonial, her Tagalog, utilitarian. So Tagalog is another major Philippine language. English had become for her the language of her heart. Our literary history would reveal that there were a number of Philippine women writers from the 1920s onwards, and many of them were talented as their male counterparts. As critic Edna Zapanta Manlacas claims, in these early decades, the English language offered Filipino women writers the unprecedented opportunity to play a formative role in the Philippines or in birthing a new body of work soon to be known as Philippine literature in English. So if we talk about Philippine literature in English, we cannot avoid talking about the role of women in developing this literature. The early Philippine novels in English were similar to the early novels in Spanish and Tagalog. The first novel in English is considered a melodramatic novel about love, practically a Tagalog novel in English. Most of our novels or early short stories were about love. The Filipino Revel, published in 1927, is a novel about the American occupation. And this novel also echoes our earlier novels in Spanish, like the Noli Me Tangere and El Filibusterismo. From the 1950s onwards, the Philippine novel in English exhibited a distinct use of the English language. As for women novelists, after the Second World War, Quirima Pulutan and national artist Edith Tiempo made their mark in Philippine literature in English. Pulutan's Hand of the Enemy and Tiempo's novels, A Blade of Fern and His Native Coast, these are just two of her many, many novels. These embody the historical realities of their period. Tiempo's novels, although not appreciated as her poetry, have been reread for the strength of their female characters. And Pulotan's only novel, on the other hand, earned her the 1961 Stonehill Pen Fellowship. In 1963, Pulotan received the highest award for a Filipino artist. Pulotan has lasted as a writer longer than any of her male contemporaries. There was indeed a steady rise in the number of publications of Philippine novels in the 20th century. Even during the martial law period, publication continued to the 1980s and after the EDSA Revolution. The EDSA Revolution for us is very important because this deposed our former dictator. And after the EDSA Revolution, we had several university presses flourishing, and all of them headed by women directors. So that was a huge change in Philippine literature. The 1970s produced 19 titles, the 1980s, 51, and from the late 90s to the 2000s, there were around 5 to 7 titles of novels a year. I know this sounds the number sounds very small, but considering how difficult it is to publish novels, compared to these days when everybody just publishes online, this was an accomplishment on our part. Although, like the novels of English in the early decades, those of the 20th century were still about the Philippine nation. The later narratives employ various strategies that render the complexities of both the historical past and present. A number of novelists who actively published in the 1990s and the 2000s were women, some of whom have published more than one novel. That the nation was still the preoccupation of the Philippine novel in English during this period, and that many of the writers were women, should come as no surprise, considering the history of Philippine novels in English. Despite arguments about the dissolution of the nation and the precariousness of the concept, we have yet to read a categorical declaration of the death of the nation. As globalization became very popular, people say that the concept of the nation is already dead. We cross borders. There's no such thing as national borders. And despite the ambiguity and the elusiveness of the idea of the nation, because of the tectonic shifts in geopolitics, the nation still continues many Philippine discourses in general and novels in particular. And the tenacity of the gendered nature of the national discourse is not a recent development, considering the nature of the nation as a collective imagination. For my study, which was eventually published as a book, the novels I analyzed were published from 1993 to 2000. Some of them are more obviously about the nation, while others not. I looked at how women are discursively deployed in the name of the nation and the nation state. By discursive deployment, I refer to how the novels as discourse weave women into the narratives of the nation. We always have the women in the story of the nation. It's common in the Philippines. Also inspired by Michel Foucault's idea that the body manifests the stigmata of the past experience and also gives rise to desires, failing, and errors, my analysis shows how the discourse of the nation-state is inscripted in the body of, or the bodies of the female characters in the novels, and how ultimately the discourse of the nation-state is linked to the larger narrative of imperialism and globalization. Bearing in mind that all nationalisms are gendered, all are invented, all are dangerous, we cannot take as given and unproblematic how novels narrativize the Philippine nation. A system of cultural representation enabling people to identify themselves with an experience shared by a community, nations are historical practices through which social difference is both invented and performed. In the realm of representations, we could look at the social body, which is identified as the representational use of the body as a natural symbol that stands for nature, society, and culture. Thus, as a social body, the Filipino woman's body is conventionally used as a symbol in discourse, such as literature, which often stands for the Philippine nation. Thus, in examining the relationship between nation narrativity and gender, I ask the following questions. What constructions of the nation are articulated in Philippine women novels in English? What relations between women, women's bodies, and the nation are articulated or inscribed in the novels? Do these novels engender a weak, feminine, service-oriented nation that feeds into the grand narratives of imperialism and globalization? My discussion today is based on my study, which was eventually developed into a book. I borrowed the title of my study from Anne McClintock, Amir Mufti, and Ellen Shohat's Dangerous Liaisons, Gender, Nation, and Post-Colonial Perspectives. I share with these critics the belief that the seemingly natural relationship between women and nature is hardly unproblematic, and thus we have to question this. From 1993 to 2000, there were 20 novels published in Philippines by Philippine women writers, and out of these 20 novels, I chose 7. These are the 7 novels I studied. Gina Apostol's Bibliolepsy, Merlinda Bobis's Banana Heart Summer, Linda T. Casper's Dream Eden, Cristina Pantoja Hidalgo's Recuerdo and A Book of Dreams, and Azucena Grajo Uranza's A Passing Season and Women of Tammuz. For this morning's presentation, I will include all novels except for Hidalgo's second novel, just to shorten the discussion. Examples are enough. Over the years, we have witnessed the onslaught of theorization on the nation and narration in the field of literary studies, cultural studies, and even in the social sciences, particularly in sociology and history. I think we're always haunted by the concept of the country, the nation. Scholars from post-colonial nations have written on how gender has become metaphorically glossed over in the predominantly male-oriented discourses of the nation. When we talk about the nation, it's always the woman. But when we need the strong impression of the nation, it's always the man. Okay? Indeed, women have not just been simply historical subjects of the nation, but have likewise been used as symbols of the homeland, which in turn have made their insertion into the discourse of the nation more problematic. Moreover, women have continued to suffer the fate of invisibility in these discourses on the nation, which is quite ironic, considering the persistence in colonial and post-colonial discourses of woman as trope. When I say woman as trope, I think more of you are familiar with the idea of the motif. Not the woman always, you see the woman in all your paintings, your literatures, your other forms of art. But it is precisely this trope or motive that has made woman as a given, that is, an assumed image whose presence in the discourse is taken as natural, which has ultimately made her invisible. I find useful the idea that the integration of women into modern nationhood, epitomized by citizenship in a sovereign nation state, somehow follows a different trajectory from that of men. Because the state has its own hegemonic discourse of gender relations, one must then reckon with gender regions of nationalist projects and determine how women can, and at the same time, participate actively and become hostages to such projects. Critic Candioti shows the vagaries of the national discourse, nuanced by the changing portrayals of women as victims of social backwardness, icons of modernity, or privileges bearers of cultural authenticity. So in a way, we talk about women, they're idealized, but at the same time, they also sometimes represent backwardness because they represent tradition. From McClintock, I take the notion that nationalisms are dangerous because they represent relations to political power and technologies of violence. Nations are therefore not simply phantasmagoria of the mind. She also references Cynthia Enloe, who claims that nationalisms have typically sprung from masculinized memory, masculinized humiliation, and masculinized hope. Thus, if nationalism is masculinized, then we as readers cannot assume that narratives of the nation written by female characters, or writers rather, necessarily are different from the male writers' masculinized renderings of the nation. I also borrow from Timothy Brennan's The National Longing for Form, which posits that it is particularly in the Third World, after the Second World War, that fictional uses of the nation and nationalisms are more pronounced. I'm not, perhaps we can do a comparative analysis also, like in Thailand what is your favorite genre to represent the nation? In the Philippines or in most third world countries, it's the novel because it's a long genre of hundreds of pages. Okay? His assertions regarding the nation and the third world artists could very well apply to novels by Filipino artists. The nation as a discursive formation is not simply an allegory of imaginative vision, but a gestative political structure which the third world artist is constantly building or suffering the lack of. His description of the post-war novels could very well apply to the environment surrounding the Philippine novel in English. For him, the peculiarity of the post-war novels lies in the fact that they are embedded in a world characterized by a vast network of communications, widespread politics of insurgent nationalism, and a huge international culture organization, which have made issues of nationalism and exile more important to everyone. So I examine thus how the novels objectify the national life and approximate the construction of the nation. All of these novels have a disquieting sense of history of the Philippine nation. They have in different ways shown the mark or the failures of our nation. And these very wounds or the failures of our nation become the impulses for deploying alternative narratives of the nation. From the most conventional historical novels like Passing Season and Women of Tammuz, to the most postmodern novel like Bibliolepsy and Recuerdo, one cannot miss the narrative's act of imagining and imaging the Philippine nation with all its failures while simultaneously critiquing the masculinist discourses of the nation. A Passing Season and Women of Tammuz foreground the active participation of women and other social marginals like homosexuals in the Philippine struggle for independence from Spaniards, the Japanese, and the American. These two novels are part of a series of 4 novels. A Passing Season takes us through 2 wars of Philippine history, the 1896 Philippine Revolution and the 1898 Filipino-American War, and chronicles the fate of 3 families. Another observation of Philippine women novels in English is that they're most often about families, personal biographies. In Women of Tammuz, the world enveloping the characters of the novel revolves around the relatively peaceful days of the American colonial rule and the grim years of the Japanese occupation. The narrative follows the lives of 2 families and their circle of friends, and among them it is the woman and homosexuals participating in the war against the Japanese who take center stage. Refuting not only male-centered but also homogeneous stories of the nation is the novel Recuerdo. Recuerdo is Spanish, but in English it means memories. The novel graphs or reconstructs the history of the narrator's family by grafting incrementally into the narrative unaccountable stories. So actually the whole novel is about the story of each member of a family. The story of all the grandfathers, the mothers, the daughters. Okay. It's a composite story of women. Okay. Similarly, it is a woman's relationship with her nation that is highlighted in the protagonist's letter to her mother in Banana Heart Summer. A novel that treats the reader to a feast not just of a sumptuous array of Filipino food and recipes integrated into the narrative of the protagonist, but to a string of stories and tales both hilarious and poignant. The novel opens with a series of whens, the events that happened in the life of the protagonist who at 40 years old relates the story or the stories of the most important summer of her life. So this story is like a flashback. Okay? The point of view or the voice is that of a 40-year-old woman telling her experiences as a child. And in Bibliolepsy by Gina Apostol, the protagonist re-implots her personal narrative and the narrative of the EDSA revolution. While the novel's part 1 depicts the mysterious disappearance and death of the protagonist's parents, part 2 explains what compels the protagonist to write fiction. a revelation that impinges on the very nature of the novel itself and her participation in the 1986 revolution. The transition from the protagonist's personal experiences and that of the nations, which is of EDSA, is not quite a big leap if one considers the narrative of both experiences. Also about EDSA revolution is Linda T. Casper's Dream Eden, which is an example of the relationship between the interiority of Filipino martyrdom, the Christian figures of the dead Christ and the Virgin Mary, and the 1986 EDSA revolution, a discourse laced with the narratives of Mary, Christ, and people power, leading to the overthrow of the former dictator Ferdinand Marcos. Because we were colonized by the Spaniards, the Philippines is the only Catholic nation in Asia. So you will also see in our novels the presence of, in different ways, the Virgin Mary, the Christ, or Jesus Christ. These are figures very, very strong. The phenomenon is an interesting illustration of how the modern concept of nationalism and the nation are informed by discourses of the Catholic Church. Sometimes we cannot distinguish between religion and politics because our church also is very much involved in politics. The novel brings to fore how the Virgin Mary, as an iconic signifier, can morph into different symbols at different historical moments. Crucial to our own reading of the construction of EDSA or our nation is an understanding of how the Virgin Mary, as an intercessor, is transposed upon the geopolitical stage. That is how a religious figure is conveniently and easily connected with the discourse of nationalism. So after the EDSA revolution, there's this huge construction of a sculpture in EDSA, that important highway in the Philippines. And this is the Virgin Mary, which is testament to how we believe that the EDSA revolution is miraculous. How we were able to overthrow a 20-year dictatorship. And later on, I'll explain this a little bit more. Since the novels are written by women from the middle class, readers might expect them to reflect the writer's class position. The novels, however, do not presume to speak for the national experience of the entire population. There are indeed fissures even among women from the bourgeois class and other social marginals. In passing season, the helper cannot dream of a life beyond the confines of the four walls of her nations or of her master's house. In Recuerdo, there is a fissure among women belonging to the same bourgeois family. As the protagonist tries to fill in the gaps in the narrative of the life of Leonor, the first desgraciada in the family. Desgraciada, again, is Spanish. Literally, it means unfortunately, but in the Philippines, when we talk about desgraciada, she's a woman who was left behind by her husband. Okay. And in Banana Heart Summer, fissures among women of the same working class is imprinted in the protagonist's back, which is marked by her mother's whipping. In Banana Heart Summer, this is about a child who talks about how she was physically abused by her mother. Because they were so poor, her mother, took it. The mother was so frustrated by their poverty, so that every time she would whip her child. No? In showing how women are complexly inserted in the narratives that are both about women's lives and the life of the nation, the novels illustrate the range of positions occupied by women. In revealing the many ways women position themselves and are positioned in the narrative, the novels likewise reveal problems when women are treated as icons or representations of the nation. We cannot just be happy because women represent the nation. We also have to be critical of this. First, connecting women to nation or associating woman to nation is dangerous to women because it is seductive. Nationalisms and those who speak its language have conveniently used woman as inang bayan or motherland or mother nation. Again, it would be interesting to compare what is the equivalent of this motherland in Thai literature. This mother nation, it's a figure that inveighs the public to think that woman's position in the nation and social life is secure, significant, and positive. More insidiously, the metaphorical use of women allows the masculinist discourse of the nation to seduce women to sacrificing themselves to the men who are supposed to fight for the nation. Secondly, the woman as nation motif is problematic because it interpolates both women and nation, both women and men. Men as active subjects and women as passive objects of desire. To take woman to stand for the nation is to discourage a full understanding of how women and men are inserted in a patriarchally constructed discourse. It must be noted that the novels discussed cannot rid themselves of the symbolic woman which embodies the Philippine nation. So all of these novels I discuss also involve women. The only advantage is that they are more critical about how women are positioned in the nation. Notwithstanding the critical stance and to some extent skepticism about the existence of a sense of identity and collectivity among women of the same class, race, and even families, the novels do posit an experience of the nation, although not a homogeneous one. What readers get would be layers and layers of contesting discourses which inform the woman as nation. For example, in Dream Eden, these are nuns who were very important in the EDSA revolution, and Dream Eden as a novel talks about how women from different sectors participated in the EDSA revolution. The vocabularies of nationalism and the nation state oscillate between idealizing women as mothers, sisters, and lovers of the nation, and on the other hand, portraying women as liabilities to the national struggle. All novels have a different way of showing how women are inserted or how women negotiate their position in the nation. Now, what makes the novel a promising genre for post-colonial writers? This is very important to understand why the novel is our favorite genre. Because the novel has a sense of something more at the end. There is a sense of something more at the end of the story of the nation. A very important concept is hope. Hope lingers because the narrator cannot stop talking. In the end of the novel is the word. And as long as the word exists, the possibility of connection exists, no matter how resolutely the author attempts to prove otherwise. For example, in some of the novels, despite the cumbrous history of the Philippine nation, the women in particularly who have been at the mercy of history will persist. Critic Hayden White claims the narrative is what translates knowing into telling, so that both historiography in novels, the narrator's conventions, far from being restraining factors, actually offer enabling conditions of possibility or of sense-making. So the novel enables us to tell a story. It enables us to give hope. And a very important idea would be agency. It gives us the voice. And I think this is very important considering the forum this morning. The voice, the novel as a genre, gives us the ability to tell our stories. All novels work out the issues of nation formation, women in Philippine history, and narration. Because the novels expose the problem of sexing the Philippines as a woman, they ultimately refuse to be part of the language of globalization, where the weaker nations like the Philippines are at the mercy of a masculine nation states. All novels are, to borrow another critic's words, significant commentaries on the workings of nationalism as it is told, heard, retold, and practiced. All novels are reconstellations of the national discourse because they change the configuration of nationalism by calling attention implicitly and explicitly to the relationship between woman and nation. At the core of all the novels is Philippine history. Okay? It has proven to be malleable in the hands of Philippine women writers in English. And as much as the novels deploy the symbols of nationalism, they also question and demystify the women. Now, moving forward and looking at the selected novels in the 21st century, I would like to mention 3 novels which I believe are very important. We were strongly hit by Typhoon Haiyan. I have 3 novels which revolve around the world's strongest Super Typhoon Yolanda, or known internationally as Typhoon Haiyan, which led over 5,000 people dead, 1,800 people missing, and 14 million people affected in the province of Leyte, in the Visayas. So these are pictures of the typhoon. Located in Southeast Asia between South China Sea and the Western Pacific Ocean, the Philippine archipelago, with 7,100 islands, is vulnerable to typhoons, storms, surges, or sudden rises of water that hit surrounding areas during storms and typhoons. Every year, we have at least 20 typhoons. And some of the deadliest typhoons come to us during Christmas season, which is December, which makes everything more horrible for us because it's a Christmas season and we find people dead, after a typhoon. So this is one novel, Daryl Delgado's Remains. It's about a woman who returns to Leyte as a worker to talk about the experience. She's a journalist, She's a journalist, and when she rides a plane, the C-130 Hercules plane, she looks down and she sees all the dead bodies, and then as the plane lands, she smells the horrible smell of decaying bodies. This is about her experience. She returns to her hometown. Okay, this one is Broken Islands by Criselda Yabes. Again, another novel that revolves around how two female characters return to their province after the typhoon. And these two female characters now try to resolve their conflict with the family. And then one of the female characters eventually stays, and because she sees how politics in her town is very corrupt, she decides to stay and run for office, believing that she can change things in her province. Okay, the other story is about the second narrative. If we look at all these novels, they have several narratives all happening at the same time. Okay, and the third novel is Caroline Howe's Tiempo Muerto. Tiempo Muerto is Spanish, which means dead season. This is the time, this Tiempo Muerto, a lot of people starve because they have to wait for the harvest. Okay. So again, this is about the return of two women to their hometown. One woman who is an overseas contract worker, a helper, tries to look for her mother who disappeared during the typhoon. And the other woman, who is very rich, returns to avoid a scandal in Singapore. So they all belong to one family, the domestic helper and her mistress. Okay. So in the end, the two women decide to stay in their hometown and resolve issues of their families. Now again, you have all these issues happening to the women's families. Okay. The three stories are very interesting, not just because, again, they are still about the Philippine nation, but within the context of a bigger problem, which is climate change. And I think that is what is getting to be more popular in the Philippines now. I have students who lost their families to the typhoon. I only realized how they lost their parents, their relatives, and all their families in Leyte when they submitted to me their poems and their short stories. So all of them within the context of a bigger narrative which is the climate change. Also, just an important note, in Philippine novels in English, we are very fond of another trope or motif is the return of the character. The impetus of our novels is always given by the return of one major character to the Philippines. From the earliest novels of Jose Rizal to our more contemporary issues, it's always a male returning to the Philippines and trying to resolve a problem. But with the latest novels by women, it's the return of female characters to the Philippines and trying to resolve their issues with their family. And in doing so, they talk about the Philippine nation, making critics say that the biography of the characters is also the biography of the Philippine nation. Okay. So Now, women in these narratives are no longer symbols of the nation, but figures who expose the susceptibility of women. An example is how Tiempo Muerto's protagonist describes the OFW. The OFW for us is the overseas Filipino workers. I'm sure you have them here. You have Filipino women, Filipino men and women working in Thailand. We call them overseas Filipino workers. We also call them the Bagong Bayani. They are our new heroes because they support the Philippine nation economically. They send money to their families in the Philippines. But in Tiempo Muerto, the novel questions this very idea of idealizing the Filipino workers abroad. Okay? As one of the protagonists say, I'll show you, this is a picture of how thousands and thousands of Filipinos leave the Philippines every day to work abroad, okay, to support their families. Okay? One of the characters say, we foreign workers are like ghosts. We're visible and invisible, inside and outside. We are not here, we are not there. We live with families without being part of them. We work at home without being at home. We are homebound and homeless. We fade into furniture and walls, vanish around corners, hover on the edges of people's eyes and minds. The woman as nation trope, or as motif, is also known as the Inang Bayan, okay, mother nation trope. It is a trope. This is, of course, not confined in literature. No? We find them in almost all discourses. This is an example. We see them in paintings. I'm not familiar. I'm not sure if you're familiar. This is the former president of the Philippines, wife of our former dictator Ferdinand Marcos, and mother of our current president Bongbong Marcos. No? She has this picture of, see her here? She's like the mother nation, huh? Embracing her people. Okay. In an ironic twist, this picture is a picture of our former first lady years after Ferdinand Marcos. So she's Cory Aquino, the main figure of the EDSA revolution. The death of her husband led to the revolution against the husband of Imelda Marcos. So here, she is also our mother nation. She is also our mother nation, right? And during our last elections, I've probably heard of her in 2022, Leni Robredo, she's also our mother nation. So all Philippine women, women running for president, show themselves as the mother of the nation. And what's interesting here, which also kind of offended some of us, she's associated with the Virgin Mary. Now, it pushed the image further and say, oh, she's the Virgin Mary. Okay? So, all women, no? Inang Bayan. Okay. So, the trope is also captured in other artworks. This is España y Filipinas by a famous painter recognized in Europe in the 19th century, Juan Luna. This is Spain, this is the Philippines. Both mother nations, no? Like, heading towards the future. Okay, we have the Inang Bayan in paintings by contemporary artists. Again, we have the Inang Bayan in sculpture by a famous national artist, Guillermo Tolentino. And we also have ballets which perform pieces about our mother nation. Okay. The nation is a web of textual, cultural, and social networks that come together in the construction of collective entities referred to as the people and the nation. And because women are metaphorically conjoined with the nation, actual women have to perpetually walk the political, economic, historical, and cultural tightrope. Women are both of and not the nation. Between woman and nation is perhaps the space or zone where we can deconstruct these monoliths and render them more historically nuanced and accountable to politics. This space or zone, referred to Kaplan, Alarcon, and Moalem, could very well be that provided by the narrative, the novel. We take advantage of that space. That the women characters in the novels are both of and not the nation could actually present a possible field where the dangers of liaising women with nation are confronted. Whether as victims of colonialism, imperialism, or internal national conflicts, or as positive symbols of the nation, such as the Inang Bayan in the 19th century to the early 20th century nationalist discourse, or the much-touted Bagong Bayani or New Heroes of the 21st century, the woman as nation trope has to be continuously re-examined. The different texts I discussed reveal the inconsistencies in the discourse of the nation. In many ways, cathecting women to nation ironically paves the way for the interrogation of the trope itself. As texts lead us to question the trope, we get to grasp women's fraught relationship with the other citizens of their state, with the state itself, and within the context of globalization. A clearer picture of women's insertion vis-a-vis the global order could lead to the construction of alternative discourses the nation, which will hopefully and positively affect women's real and material conditions. Moreover, these alternative discourses could provide women with agency with which to negotiate their relations with their state. Thank you very much. So last slide. Thank you.
ครับขอขอบคุณนะครับองค์ปาฐกนะครับและในลำดับต่อไปนะครับขอเรียนเชิญผู้ช่วยศาสตราจารย์ดร.ชุติมามณีวัฒนานะครับขึ้นสรุปประเด็นครับขอเรียนเชิญครับ
ขออนุญาตรีแลกซ์นะคะอาจารย์เรียนท่านศาสตราจารย์สุวรรณานะคะท่านอาจารย์ตรีสินด้วยอาจารย์สุรเดชนะคะแล้วก็แขกผู้มีเกียรติทุกท่านนะคะดิฉันก็ได้รับมอบหมายเนาะให้สรุปประเด็นซึ่งตอนแรกอ่านจากสิ่งที่อาจารย์รุธเขียนมาเนี่ยดิฉันก็ไปไกลเลยสรุปเยอะมากเลยเมื่อวานมาซ้อมด้วยกันก็เลยบอกอาจารย์ว่าเดี๋ยวอาจารย์อยากให้สรุปยังไงอาจารย์ก็ไปเขียนมา1 หน้า ก็เลยเมื่อเช้าได้รับจากอาจารย์ก็แปลสดๆนะคะซึ่งสิ่งที่อาจารย์เขียนนั้นดีมากๆนะคะก็น่าจะได้ช่วยได้ดีนะคะคือในการนำเสนอเมื่อสักครู่นะคะอาจารย์ก็ได้พูดถึงปัญหาของความหลากหลายในการใช้สตรีเป็นตัวแทนของชาตินะคะโดยการศึกษานวนิยายทั้งหมด7เรื่องของนักเขียนหญิงชาวฟิลิปปินส์นะคะแล้วจากงานวิจัยของอาจารย์เนี่ยค่ะอาจารย์ก็มุ่งศึกษาไปที่การทำให้ภาพของสตรีนั้นเป็นตัวแทนของความเป็นชาติที่มันเกิดขึ้นอยู่บ่อยๆนะคะคราวนี้คำนี้ค่ะอาจารย์ใช้คำว่า women as nation trope เมื่อเช้าก็ถามอาจารย์ nation trope นี่เป็นยังไงก็คือเป็นภาพของความเป็นชาติที่เกิดขึ้น trope ในที่นี้คือเหมือน motif ที่เกิดขึ้นซ้ำๆใช่ไหมคะอาจารย์ค่ะคราวนี้ในฟิลิปปินส์เนี่ยค่ะโดยปกติแล้วสตรีก็จะถูกนำมาใช้เป็นตัวแทนของความเป็นชาติในประเด็นของมาตุภูมินะคะแล้วก็จะเป็นภาพของผู้หญิงคือความเป็นแม่เป็นพี่สาวเป็นลูกสาวนะคะซึ่งภาพพจน์เหล่านี้มันถูกทำให้เกิดขึ้นแบบเป็นอุดมคติคือ idealize ขึ้นมานะคะแล้วก็บางครั้งเนี่ยสตรีก็ยังถูกนำมาใช้ในฐานะที่เป็นภาระอีกด้วยนะคะบางอย่างเป็นภาระของชาติอะคะเช่นเป็นสัญลักษณ์ของความล้าหลังด้วยนะคะคราวนี้เรื่องของการศึกษาจากนวนิยายที่เขียนขึ้นโดยนักเขียนสตรีเหล่านี้ค่ะก็แสดงให้เห็นถึงความขัดแย้งกันเองในภาพของสตรีที่เกิดขึ้นบ่อยๆในนิยายกับสิ่งที่พบในนวนิยายเนี่ยก็คือว่าสตรีเนี่ยจะอยู่ในบทบาทภายใต้วัฒกรรมของรัฐชาติเขาเจอความขัดแย้งกันเองในนวนิยายหลายเรื่องนะคะแล้วก็ด้วยเหตุที่นิยายเนี้ยค่ะได้แสดงให้เห็นถึงปัญหาของการอินเสิร์ตภาพผู้หญิงเหล่านี้เข้าไปในการเล่าเรื่องของความเป็นชาติเนี่ยค่ะภาพพวกนี้ก็ทำให้เห็นว่าวิธีการเล่าใหม่ๆเนี่ยมันเกิดขึ้นมาแล้วมันก็ไม่ใช่มุมมองแบบผู้ชายเป็นศูนย์กลางอีกต่อไปแล้วนะคะก็อาจารย์แนะนำนะคะว่าอาจารย์รูธแนะนำนะคะในฐานะของนักวิชาการเนี่ยก็เป็นเรื่องที่น่าสนใจเหมือนกันถ้าเราจะได้ลองศึกษาไปที่งานประเภทอื่นๆด้วยนะคะเช่นการความเป็นชาติภาพของสตรีในความเป็นชาติในงานที่เจอพวกจิตรกรรมประติมากรรมหรืองานนาฏกรรมอะไรอย่างเงี้ยรวมถึงงานกลุ่มโฆษณาด้วยนะคะก็น่าสนใจ แล้วนอกจากนี้นะคะอาจารย์ยังบอกว่าเราอาจจะศึกษาภาพพจน์ของสตรีในฐานะของแม่ของชาติหรือว่า mother of the nation เนี่ยว่ามันได้ถูกพลิกไปในรูปแบบอื่นในศิลปะอื่นๆยังไงไหมเช่นในงานการแสดงผ่านโทรทัศน์เป็นต้นนะคะสุดท้ายค่ะอาจารย์บอกว่าจริงๆถ้าเราสามารถตระหนักรู้ถึงปัญหาเนี่ยของการผลิตภาพสตรีแบบซ้ำๆในสื่อต่างๆที่กล่าวมาได้เราอาจจะหาวิธีในการพัฒนาสภาพที่มันเป็นอยู่ของผู้หญิงในโลกแมทเทียลนี้ก็เป็นได้นะคะก็ขอบพระคุณทุกท่านแล้วก็การนำเสนอของอาจารย์รูธก็เป็นประโยชน์มากๆกับพวกเราขอบพระคุณค่ะ
ครับขอบพระคุณผู้ช่วยศาสตราจารย์ดร.ชุติมามณีวัฒนานะครับและในโอกาสต่อไปนะครับขอเรียนเชิญศาสตราจารย์กิตติคุณดร.สุวรรณาสถาอนันต์นะครับให้เกียรติมอบของที่ระลึกแด่องค์ปาฐกด้านบนนะครับแล้วก็มอบของที่ระลึกแด่ผู้สรุปประเด็นนะครับผู้ช่วยศาสตราจารย์ดร.ชุติมามณีวัฒนาด้วยเช่นเดียวกันนะครับขอเรียนเชิญด้านบนนะครับจบไปแล้วนะครับสำหรับการเสวนาในช่วงแรกนะครับซึ่งเป็นเสียงจากวรรณกรรมและวรรณคดีนะครับนักศึกษาเราเป็นยังไงบ้างครับ นักศึกษาเราแบบช่วงแรกนะครับเดี๋ยวช่วงต่อไปนะครับจะเป็นช่วงที่เป็นเสียงจากดนตรีแล้วนะจะขยับแบบให้นักศึกษารู้สึกว่าผ่อนคลายนะครับแล้วก็รีแลกซ์หน่อยนึงนะครับตอนนี้นักศึกษาเริ่มรู้สึกว่านะครับแต่ว่าเราจะเห็นความหลากหลายนะครับของมนุษยชาตินะครับซึ่งมีลักษณะทั้งร่วมกันแล้วก็แตกต่างกันแล้ว
ค่ะเชิญอาจารย์ขอบพระคุณค่ะ
ครับขอบพระคุณทุกท่านนะครับขอบพระคุณองค์ปาฐกที่ท่านให้เกียรติกับเวทีนี้นะครับ